time and for helping us. Please send your Holy Spirit to be with us, and may we ever be drawn closer to you. And please give us discernment, help us to learn the things that are important about the things of the chronology you've given to us in your word. And please bless Brother Theodore presents and help us to comprehend. I pray all these things in Jesus' holy name. Amen.
Amen. Good morning. And we're studying chapter 11, but we're starting on page 75. And I'm going to look at the beginning part of chapter 11 later on, maybe even today, but definitely tomorrow. So this is when I'm presenting this message to Seventh-day Adventists, to people who could be Levites, this is the first study I give them. One is, even though there's some things about it that could be difficult to understand, I can present it in a simple way where they can see that the 2300 days and the 70 weeks begin in 457 BC, as we all already understand, but it shows it in a way that we have light dealing with chiasms that helps establish both the start of the 70 weeks and the 2300 days in ways that Seventh-day Adventists have never seen it before. And so we're going to go through this slowly, and we're going to start at Daniel chapter 9, verse 25. So I've placed on the board the year 457 BC. Now I have up here, this is the events of 515 BC, where we had the dedication of the temple on the third day of the 12th month, Adar, and then we had the Passover following on the 14th day of the first month. So this was in Ezra, I can never remember, 6 verse, I can't remember if it's 15 or 17, and this is in Ezra 6, one of the other verses, 19 I think this is. So this is either 15 or 17, or I think this is 15. Verse 14 and 15, I believe. If it's wrong, we can correct it. Now, when we look at Daniel 9, verse 25, the way that we read it, so if we want to start, Alyssa, do you want to read Daniel 9, verse 25?
Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times.
Okay, thank you. So when we read this, how we read it is we read it as the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem. And we take it as one event. But when you look at the Hebrew, and there's also the Bishop's Bible, which is a translation that is before the King James, they translate it differently than you see here in the King James. Now, the King James is correct in its translation, but it uses a word, the word restore, that has a different meaning than it did in 1611 from what it has now. So when you think of the word restore, what do you think of the word restore? Rebuilding, fixing up, restoring something back to its original condition. Now that's the word shuv. So remember when we said that in the spring that you have the return of the year, or when you return to the land. So when the Jews go back to Babylon, the word that they use, or back to Jerusalem from Babylon, the word they use is shuv. And this is what the verse says. Know therefore and understand from the going forth of the commandment to return and to build. And it's a 3-step process. Now, William Miller understood the going forth of the commandment to be when? When did he understand that the commandment went forth? Does anybody know? So the commandment went forth, not just in 457 BC, but it happened on the first day of the first month. Now, why does it go forth on the first day of the first month? How is he interpreting the going forth of the commandment? The commandment's given by Artaxerxes, and then Ezra leaves Babylon with the commandment in his hand, the decree. So to Miller, that was the going forth of the commandment. So he had it in the spring. So he didn't really say the first day of the first month, he just said in the spring. But he understood that as being the first day of the first month. He just didn't state it explicitly. So on the first day of the first month, we find from Ezra chapter 7. So we're going to go through this, Ezra chapter 7 to 10, and see some things that we may not have noticed before. So we know in Ezra 7:9, it says, upon the first day of the first month began he to go up from Babylon. On the first day of the fifth month came he to Jerusalem, according to the good hand of his God upon him. So then we would have to look at, if the going forth is here, when is the return? According to Daniel 9:25. If this is the going forth of the commandment to return or restore, it would be the first day of the fifth month. So this would be the going forth, and this is the return. Now where's the to build? So that's a good question. That for Seventh-day Adventists, when do we have the 2300 days begin? What date do we give?
457.
We just say 457. We actually have no starting point for the 2300 days. We say it's 457 BC, and we might even say that it was the fall, right, that the commandment goes into effect. But we have no specific event to mark that. Now, one of the things we find when we look at in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, we find no record of them keeping the Day of Atonement. So why would that be? The Day of Atonement, the 10th day of the 7th month. Why is it not mentioned in Ezra and Nehemiah? Why did they not keep it? There's no ark in the temple. They can't keep the Day of Atonement. And actually, when you read in Nehemiah, they start studying the book of the law again in Nehemiah in 444, and they find that there's these commandments to keep these feasts in the fall, but they can't keep the Day of Atonement. They don't state it quite that way, but that's what's implied. And they weep over the fact that their sins can't be blotted out. So, but they recognize they can keep the Feast of Tabernacles, which they do. So they couldn't keep the Day of Atonement in 444, and they couldn't keep it in 457 because the ark had been hidden and it's not in the temple. And this is an important point when we think about the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary. God didn't have the ark restored when he built the second temple because he was leading God's people to look to the heavenly sanctuary. So nowhere from the time that the temple is destroyed in 586 do we have a Day of Atonement celebrated by the Jews. They can't celebrate the Day of Atonement. So God allowed that to happen so that the Jews would understand that that system was going to be replaced by Christ's heavenly ministry. So this is a point that's often missed. Now, in looking at this, in Ezra chapter 7, obviously we have the first day of the first month and the first day of the fifth month, and we have Artaxerxes' decree. So one of the things about Artaxerxes' decree that critics of Adventism have is that it really doesn't say anything about building the city or building the sanctuary. His decree, if we look at it, let's just take a look at it. So Ezra 7, Kathy, do you want to read verse? So in verse 21, Artaxerxes going on, there's a bunch of things in his decree where he's giving all these offerings for the temple, all this gold and silver. But if we read verse 25 and 26, we actually get to the heart of the decree, what the decree is about. So Ezra 7, verse 25 and 26, if we can read those.
And thou, Ezra, after the wisdom of thy God that is in thine hand, set magistrates and judges, which may judge all the people that are beyond the river, all such as know the laws of thy God, and teach ye them that know them not. And whosoever will not do the law of thy God, and the law of the king, let judgment be executed speedily upon him, whether it be unto death, or to banishment, or to confiscation of goods, or to imprisonment.
Okay, thank you. So what is this decree about? What is Artaxerxes doing in this decree for the Jews? A sovereignty of sorts. I mean, he's allowing them to set up a civil administration. I mean, they're still sort of under the Persian Empire.
Well, they're operating under the ancient idea of a vassal.
Of a vassal, yes. And they have now the power for the death penalty, to take goods, to banish, and there's 4 of them, and imprisonment, yeah. So all those 4 powers, and those would be civil powers to enact their laws. So this is something that, if we think about it, when we think about the to build then, many people just think of the to build as the construction, but we know construction of the temple began under Cyrus's decree, and under Darius's decree the temple was completed. And we know that later on the streets and walls were built in 444, in 52-day period. And so obviously there's this construction going on. But when we look at Artaxerxes' decree, it doesn't say anything about structural building, but it does say something about setting up civil administration. And if we look at the steps here, the going forth, the return, and the to build to me is not about the structure of the physical part of the city, but it's about the structure of the administrative part of the city. Well, organization, yes. So if we're going to look at the to build, it's obviously going to follow these. So over here, we're going to have the to build. Now, we don't have anything in 457 BC that marks the 10th day of the 7th month. But we do have something that does, but indirectly, and we're going to look at that. So let's turn to chapter 8 of Ezra.
Are you putting the to build as the 7th?
Yeah, well, we're going to see where we're putting the to build. The to build is a period of time.
But I mean, you're putting it under the 7th intentionally, right there, or no?
I'm putting it in the fall, so we'll see
Okay.
where it is. Now, in Ezra chapter 8, we have more details about the journey from Babylon to Jerusalem. And we find that there's these priests, all these different names, and we're not going to read all these different names of people who end up leaving Babylon and going to Jerusalem. But let's start at verse 15. And do you want to just read verse 15, Olivine?
And I gathered them together to the river that runneth Ahava, and there abode we in tents 3 days, and I viewed the people, and the priests, and found there none of the sons of Levi.
Yeah. So we have Ezra coming to the river Ahava. He has priests, but no Levites with him. And how long do they stay there? So we're going to find that there's a period of 3 days here, and we're going to mark it.
How do you read that they have priests with them?
How do they have
Because
what?
from my research, there is no priest there. There are no priests. From my
Yeah, the
research
priest
that I've
is right in
done.
the-
It just says in the Bible.
Yeah, it just said there's all these priests. There's no Levites. Yeah, so there's none of the sons of Levi. And we read on verse 21. Read that verse.
Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river of Ahava, that we might afflict our soul ourselves before our God, to seek of him a right way for us, and for our little ones, and for all our substance.
Okay, so they have this fast while they're there. So this fast is going to be 3 days long. They're fasting. They're there for 3 days. They're waiting there. So they're not, the way that this is written, if we read it all through, they're sort of repeating things again. Now, he says in verse 24, and I'm going to read this. So then separated 12 of the chief of the priests, Sherebiah, Hashabiah, and 10 of their brethren with them, and they weighed unto them the silver and the gold and the vessels, even the offering of the house of our God, which the king, Artaxerxes, and his counselors and his lords and all Israel were, king and his counselors and his lords and all Israel were present, had offered. So these are the things that Artaxerxes had given, which are mentioned in his decree. So it mentions all these different items. And do you want to read verse 31, Bob?
Okay, verse 31.
And 32 and 33. Those
Okay.
3 verses.
Then we departed from the river of Ahava on the 12th day of the first month to go into Jerusalem. And the hand of God, our God, was upon us, and he delivered us from the hand of the enemy, and of such as lay in wait by the way. And we came to Jerusalem and abode there 3 days. Now on the 4th day was the silver, the gold, and the vessels weighed in the house of our God by the hand of Meremoth, the son of Uriah the priest. And with him was Eleazar, the son of Phinehas, and with them was Josazabad, the son of Yeshua, and Noadiah, the son of Binui, Levite.
Okay, thank you.
The son of Binui, Levite.
Yeah. So we have another period of 3 days. So what we find is they come to a river Ahava, there's no Levites. They proclaim a fast. They divide the gold and silver to the priests. And then once the Levites come, then they leave on the 12th day of the first month. And then they journey to Jerusalem, and when they get there, they wait 3 days before they bring the gold and the silver to the temple. So what do we have here with these 3 days? What do you see? You got 3 days on this side of this date. See, these are the dates that are given in the Bible, in the story of Ezra. What I see is a chiasm. So what would be between the 12th day of the first month and the first day of the 5th month? So how many days is this? I mean, I know it's hard to count these. So I've counted them out. And this period of time is 107 days. And we're counting the first day as the first day. And I'm suggesting that the center of this is the 6th day of the 3rd month. And I'll show you how I would do this. This is Pentecost. The 6th day of the 3rd month. And Pentecost is the 50th day from what day on the Jewish calendar?
16th.
From the 16th. So the 16th would be the 50th day, right? So the 15th would be how many days?
49.
If you're going this way, you would be from here to here. It would be 51 days, right? Because we're adding. And then the 14th would be 52 days. And the 13th would be 53. And the 12th day would be 54 days, correct?
How did you do the math for the 107? Did you add the 30, 29, 30, 29 to do the 4 months? Or did you do 30 straight? What did you do? And then
30, 29, yes.
And then you minuses minus 12?
Yes,
And then
but I'm counting the first day and the last day.
of
Because
what?
just like here, we're going to count, this is the first day. When you count here to here, it's 107 days because you're not counting with a 0, you're starting with 1. Just like here, we're starting 1. Just like with Pentecost, you start 16 is the first day. The 6th day of the 3rd month is the 50th day.
Okay, thank you.
And we will find then that this 107 days divides, because we're counting this twice, this divides into 2 periods of 54 days. Yeah. So learning how to count is one of the things in chronology that's probably one of the most difficult, because there's different ways to count. There's actually 4 different ways we can count things. But this is the way that the Bible is counting, right? If we look at Pentecost as the example of how to count, this is how we have to count this period of time. Now, of course, this is in 457 BC, and we have this chiasm that marks Pentecost. Does anybody know what Pentecost is?
Giving of the law.
Okay, it's the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. That's the original thing. And then there's commemoration. So when the disciples on the day of Pentecost have the Holy Spirit poured out upon them, they're keeping this 50 days from the 16th day of the first month. And what is happening in Acts chapter 2 in heaven when the Holy Spirit's being poured out on the disciples? Does anybody know what Ellen White says?
What is happening? What? Say that again.
So in 31 AD at Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit's, yeah, Christ is setting up his inauguration of the heavenly sanctuary ministry, which is the 70 weeks. So the 70 weeks begins in 457 BC, and in the midst of that 70th week, we have Christ setting up his heavenly ministry. But we also have it marked by this chiasm in 457 BC.
You're marking out the 6th day of the 3rd month.
Yes, Pentecost is always the 6th day of the 3rd month.
So this is 31 AD.
Well, yes, I'm marking here in 457 BC that there's this chiasm, but it is pointing to the Pentecost in 31 AD. Because this is starting the 70 weeks this year, 457 BC, and we know that the 70 weeks, the center of that 70th week is all the events of the crucifixion and Pentecost and so forth. So the fact that Pentecost is marked here by this chiasm in 457 BC is something that a Seventh-day Adventist can look at and say, that's interesting, right? So I've showed this to some Adventist pastors, and they said, that's interesting, right? Not much beyond that. Yes?
So then we understand the Passover is Christ. Christ is our Passover, the apostle writes.
Mm-hmm.
So then at the cross, the blood shed at the cross is what is the being inaugurated on the day of Pentecost in Acts.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes, he's now
so that we
beginning.
understand the connection between what takes place in the midst of the week and the 70 in the last week of the 70. The cross is pointing to Pentecost.
Yes,
And there's one other little aspect to this. When the night they leave Egypt, they're delivered from bondage.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're given the law of liberty at Pentecost.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But
So-
but it's tied to the death of the Lamb.
Yes, and there's so much about Pentecost that's interesting, and especially when we look at Millerite history and we look at our time, what it all means. So Pentecost is typifying something, the giving of the law. It also is going to, it typifies the fulfilling of the law in God's people, God writing it in his people's hearts. So Pentecost is extremely important in understanding this. Yes,
I have a
Tanya?
question. Have you ever done the math to prove that at Pentecost, after coming out of Egypt, actually the law was given? Because I haven't been able to figure it out. It always comes up later.
Yeah, I have it in
When the
my
law-
notes.
when
It's
the
all
law-
in the notes. The
when the law
Pentecost is
was
all marked there.
given on Sinai.
The dates, everything, what Ellen White says about which day of the week things happen on, it's all matched up in my chart on the Exodus. And it's much better to see it in color. So if you get the PDF version of the notes, you can see the Exodus calendar.
Do you know what page you have it on?
Yeah, it's on page 24. Okay, so now this study, when we first discovered this, we actually discovered something else first, because what we were looking at is trying to understand the to build. So let's turn, so if we look at this in chapter 8, we see that he comes to Jerusalem. If you look at chapter 9 is dealing with Ezra examining the situation, the spiritual condition of the people, and he notices these marriages to all these women who are strange wives, right, that come from other countries, other religions, because these people have come out of Babylon and they've come to Jerusalem, but they brought their wives and their children with them, and he doesn't think this is a good situation. So he mourns over this, and then he does something interesting. So we're going to look at which verses here? In chapter 10.
What you have on the board in the chart, in the book?
Yeah, it's in the book. Yeah, it's in the book in this chapter. Yeah.
Page 77?
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, in Ezra chapter 10, there's just, there's lots of different verses. So verse 7, 8, and 9. So, are you going to read that, Penny?
And they made proclamation throughout Judah and Jerusalem unto all the children of the captivity, that they should gather themselves together unto Jerusalem, and that whosoever would not come within 3 days, according to the counsel of the princes and all the elders, all his substance should be forfeited, and himself separated from the congregation of those that had been carried away. Then all the men of Judah and Benjamin gathered themselves together unto Jerusalem within 3 days. It was the 9th month, on the 20th day of the month, and all the people sat in the streets of the house of God, trembling because of this matter, and for the great rain.
Okay, thank you. So if we were going to look at this period here, so this date is given, and this date is given. So the 20th day of the 9th month. Now, let's just think of months as 30 days. It would be, you got 1, 2, 3, 4 months times 30 is 120, plus another 20 days. And that would be 140 days. Now, in reality, it's 138 days. But let's just take it as 140. If you were going to look at what was in the middle, how many days would you have to count from the first day of the first month to get 70 days? Like, where would you place that? So it's 69 days. But we already know, in understanding Ezra 7:9, that this period here, even though from the first day of the first month here, it's 120 days, right? But it's actually less. And this period here we take as how many days to the 10th day of the 7th month? We take as 70. So it's actually 69 days, and from here to here it's 69 days. But we can take it as 70 days, just because I like the number 70. And as a symbol, So this is 69. This is 69. As a symbol, we've already seen back-to-back 70s. The first from 677 to 607 and 607 to 537 is 2 periods of 70 years back-to-back. And so this is 140 days. But even if you counted it as 130 days, 138 days in 69 and 69, you'd still have the center of this chiasm as the 10th day of the 7th month. And of course, what's the significance of this in 457 BC in the middle of this to build? So his to build is setting up the civil administration. And what happens here on the 20th day of the 9th month? If people do not come to Jerusalem, what is he going to do? He can banish them or confiscate their goods. So has he set up the civil administration by this time? Yes. So this is...
Point out that this is in agreement with the decree of Artaxerxes.
Yes. So this is...
The banishment and all that is part of the decree.
Right. So it's part of the decree. So during this time, once he gets to Jerusalem, he has now set up this civil administration, and here he's enacting it. But this whole period is the whole period of the to build. And the center of this is the 10th day of the 7th month. So that means in 457 BC, we have the Day of Atonement as the center of a chiasm.
But you, to back up, you
Yeah.
stated that they couldn't keep the Day of Atonement, but nevertheless, this date falls in the center of the chiasm.
Right. So even though they can't keep the Day of Atonement, and it's not mentioned by name, it's still in the center of a chiasm.
So what this means is that Snow understood, Samuel Snow.
Yeah.
So Samuel Snow understood this, not necessarily understanding your chiastic structures, but he understood that from the 10th day of the 7th month in 457 BC is when they carried out the decree to restore and build Jerusalem that landed him in October in the 10th day of the 7th month in 1844.
Right. So for Seventh-day Adventists, we don't actually have an exact starting date for the 2300 days. We have an ending date, and we base that upon the spring and the fall types. So we say the Day of Atonement's in the fall, the cleansing of the sanctuaries in the fall, and so the 2300 days ends in the fall on the 10th day of the 7th month, but we don't really count it from this date per se. We just count it from the year 457.
And one other detail, had we not forgotten the history of the Millerites, and especially the history connected with Samuel Snow, we would have been all along understanding that it was on the 10th day of the 7th month. We would have had that date,
Yeah.
but we just left it behind and said the fall of the year.
Right. So because we weren't advancing in light, because we were backsliding, we never noticed this before. But the thing is, we notice it now. And we notice it now in this message that we have these chiasms. And of course, this message has all kinds of chiasms that we've looked at. And one of the chiasms that we already know is this chiasm. So if we go from the 10th day of the 7th month, 10th day, 7th month. My D's are terrible. And we go to the first day of the first month. We know that this is a period of 187 days. Could be a period of 190 if you used it as 120 plus 70, but this is 187 days. It's always 187 days from the first day of the first month to the 10th day of the 7th month. And we've counted out that the center of this is the 5th day of the 4th month. And this here is October 22 in 1844. So this is all 1844 now. And this is April the 19th.
July the 21st.
And July the 21st. And we already pointed out that in Ezekiel, the first date in Ezekiel is 592, and the last date is in 573. But in Ezekiel, this is the 5th day of the 4th month, and this is the 10th day of the 7th month. So this is in Ezekiel 1, verse 1 and 2. This is Ezekiel 40, verse 1. And this date here in 592 is July 21st. And this date here on the 10th day of the 7th month is October 22nd. These are 19 years apart. This is a Metonic cycle, and the dates repeat every 19 years. So these years both start on the same date. This is the Julian calendar that this year starts on. So they both start on April 19th, just as it does on the Gregorian in 1844.
Would you restate what you called the 19th year, 19 years, what is that called?
A Metonic cycle, named
Metonic,
after
that's right.
Meton, who was a Greek
Now,
mathematician.
If my memory
philosopher.
serves me correctly, did you work that out from the golden number?
Did I work it out from the golden number?
Yes, I'm asking you
No.
that. Okay.
No. All I did is
You know what the golden number is, right?
yeah, the golden ratio.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
phi.
No, not that one. There's
Not that one. Another golden number?
There's another one. It's the. I'll bring it and show it to you. It's not. It's the number 19.
Oh yeah. Well, the number 19, yes,
Right.
is very significant.
Right.
But anyway, we're not going to go there right
Right.
now.
Okay. I just wanted to know.
Yeah. So there's some interesting things about that we can do that only we do in this message that can also help us understand what is happening here. So we know about this chiasm. This chiasm here, just to complete this, we know this is 94 days. Right? Just because we're counting this day twice.
You might point out that these are numerical chiasms. Is what you're
Yes,
using.
they're numerical or chronological chiasms.
Right. Right.
Right, because there's different
So,
types of chiasms. Some
they're
people
different,
say
right.
that numerical chiasms don't exist in the Bible, that they're imaginary, that somebody just made them up. But these are things that you can't make up. You can't have these three chiasms here just point to Pentecost, the setting up of Christ's ministry in the holy place in 457, being marked there, and then also his movement to the most holy place in 457 being marked there, that these two prophecies, the 70 weeks and the 2300 days, are marking, right? You just can't make this up. Yes.
One of the key points in the fact that you can't make up, especially when you look at the 70 weeks,
Yeah.
because the last week is a mirror of the whole 490 years. It's a
Yes.
mirror because you have Christ crucified in the midst of the week,
Yes.
right? So
Yeah.
it's a 1 week equivalent of the probationary period that was placed on the Jews.
Yeah.
So you have a chiasm in the last week.
Yeah. The 2520.
Right.
His is 20. So all these different things all fit together in such a way that we have a message Seventh-day Adventists understand, from Millerite history and early Adventist history. We have things that we believe. All these things that we believe are affirmed by this new light that is coming, that comes from an understanding of Millerite history, a return to the old paths. And it's extremely powerful as a testimony to the Levites. So when we show it to Seventh-day Adventists, any Seventh-day Adventist who has looked at this has said, this has to be true. Now, there's varying degrees of how much commitment that's going to make in the individual, because just because they recognize something as true doesn't mean that they're going to continue studying it and following it. But it is a very powerful way to present ideas that we have in our message to other people. Yes, Tanya?
So what's being brought to my mind is that the point of the chiastic structure is to point to the midst of the week, to the cross, to the Lord being lifted up.
Yes.
Yeah, because Christ's chiasm is the chiasm. Because it's the curse, because Christ, cursed is everyone that hangeth upon a tree. Christ is the true curse. And we dealt with that a little bit in the superintendent remarks, just dealing with the 70 weeks, dealing with the two Lamechs. And the curse that is given, the 70 times 7, which really deals with forgiveness. So the forgiveness and the curse are tied together. So the cross of Christ, one of the criticisms early on in this message and studying the charts is, where's the cross of Christ? Where's Christ? Well, of course we know he's right here in the center of this chart. So, to say that this message isn't about Christ or isn't about the cross is to just really ignore the Bible, because the Bible is mostly prophecy. And on the road to Emmaus, Jesus opened up to the disciples there from Moses, all the law and the prophets, all the things concerning himself. He pointed them to prophecy. And prophecy reveals who Christ is, the true Christ, and it gives us faith in Christ. It develops our dependence and our conviction of sin, and it gives us power to overcome sin. That's what prophecy does. So the idea that prophecy is not important, that we just need to talk about Christ, of course, is a satanic idea. It's not, you can't know who Christ is without it. Yes, Paul.
Okay, so understanding that in the midst of these chiasms that we're seeing is, we can see it all pointing to Christ in one level,
Yeah.
but at another level, it's pointing us to events or things that are important. I mean,
Yeah.
because as I'm looking at here, I see Pentecost is the midst of one
Yes.
chiasm. I've seen Day of Atonement is the midst of the other chiasm, and up here you've got midnight
Yeah.
is the midst of the other chiasm. So, and if you're looking at this together, then you can see that Pentecost comes before midnight, obviously, looking
Yeah.
at it that way. And yeah, and then on a similar note, you're talking about the Metonic cycle, the 19 years, and it was yesterday, I believe, that you said that the first day of the first month, the earliest date that it can occur is on March 22nd, and the latest it can be is October 19th.
No, the latest.
Oh, no, April 19th, excuse
yes.
me. So if that's the case, is it during the 19-year period that it swings all the way from one to the other?
Yes. Well, it shifts around. So in the 19-year periods, there's only 19 different years. And we think, well, there's 30 days in a month. The thing about the Metonic cycle is it's actually more accurate than our calendar. So, you can have something in the same Metonic cycle and it will kind of shift a day or two here. It won't always be the same date. It's a rather complicated cycle to understand it, but that's because our calendar's not as accurate as the lunar solar calendar cycle of 19 years. It's more precise than ours is. For when you come to the 19th year, you're actually closer again to where you started than if you just add a leap year in our calendar, or like a leap day every year.
Within the 19-year period of time, though, of the Metonic cycle, do you get the whole swing from
Yes.
March 22nd all the way to April 19th?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
you do.
That was my...
Okay.
To make it clear, that Metonic cycle is rectifying the lunar year to the solar year.
Yes.
That's what it does.
And in a 19-year cycle, there's 7 leap years. So there's 7 extra months. So if you counted 7 times, if you counted 19 years and you counted how many months, 12 months, times 19, to get the number of months, again, you would have to add 7 more months to that cycle to find out how many months you have in a Metonic cycle.
And have you told them why the Jews were doing this? Why it was there was a necessity for the Metonic cycle was to keep the feasts within the seasons of the years in which they began.
Right.
So that you weren't keeping the Passover in October.
Right. So it corrects the calendar.
Because the sun is going to give you your seasons. Because the lunar calendar had to keep up with the solar calendar, so that the seasons would match the festival days.
Yeah.
And this is important when you understand that October 22nd, 1844 lands precisely where it should based on the Karaite reckoning,
Yeah.
which comes from the Jewish reckoning of the autumnal type that is in 457 BC. It gives you all of the 2300 years. That's why it's important to understand that cycle.
Yes. Now, if you look here, this date here, I just wanted to point out, and we're going to look at these dates in more detail when we look at Samuel Snow's letters. But we know that the dedication of the Second Temple was on the 3rd day of the 12th month, which on our calendar is the 12th day of the 3rd month. That is, this is March 12th, 515 BC, right? Now, when we look at this, I was trying to say that this is actually the end of the Jewish year 516 BC. That is, the next Jewish year in the spring is going to begin in the 1st month. But in 515 BC, there is no leap month, right? There is no 13th month. But in 1844, there is. So in 1844, originally they had it end in the spring, March 21st, but there was actually an extra month that was added so that the year ended in April 19th. So what Dwayne's talking about here, in 1844, they had this extra month added. But you'll see, and we're going to look at this in more detail as I said, but this is 1 month and 12 days later, or 11, depending how you count it, from when the temple was dedicated. In Ezra chapter 6, verse 15, it tells us about the dedication, and the dedication of the temple happens a month and 12 days before they have the Passover, which they mention in verse 19.
Have you figured out that the 13th month in 1844, was that the 19th year?
Well, no. The thing is, you can start the Miktonic cycle anywhere.
Okay.
So no matter where you start it. So we don't really know when it starts.
Okay.
So any year you can just start, and then it'll work out. The thing that I want to point out here is that this idea of the 12th day in the 3rd month and 3rd day 12th month, how we write these, developed in this message, so that we write the day and the month like this. And there's a significance why God had this develop. So, for instance, if we look at the distance between these two dates, here, the 3rd day of the 12th month and the 14th day of the 1st month, we could write it as 1 month and 12 days. Right? And we can see that this is the date they leave the river Ahava. Right?
So the period of time ends up turning into a date.
Yeah, a period of time can turn into a date. And we're going to see this in more detail. And so it's interesting. So let's just look at some things that we see here. What? A period of time. All I did is I just took the period of time from the dedication of the temple to the Passover as being 12 days and 1 month. And we can see that this is, if we put it as a date, this would be the 12th day of the 1st month, which is the day they leave the river Ahava. So,
the period becomes a point.
Yes, it does. That is a good point. So, when we look at some of the things here, some of the periods that we have, we can notice something. For instance, if we take 54 days, we could write this as the 5th day of the 4th month. Does that make sense? So 54 becomes a symbol of midnight. And of course, notice it's doubled, right? And also the 10th day of the 7th month, 107. So here, in this Pentecost chiasm, these spans here give you these dates in 1844, which is really interesting. Now, there's some more stuff that ends up happening. Now, some of them Samuel Snow's, so one is, when we look here, and I showed you, this I noticed a couple of years ago, that we can take a date on a Jewish calendar here like this, the 3rd day of the 12th month, but when it's converted into our calendar, it's the 12th day of the 3rd month, March 12th. And that's a coincidence, right? It doesn't happen very often, But I noticed this and I thought that's very peculiar. This dedication of the temple had this relationship between our calendar dates and the Hebrew calendar dates. So that it was an inversion of itself, that it was a mirror, right? So I put that on the back burner and I started to understand that there's a relationship between our calendar and the Jewish calendar in that we think of the Jewish calendar is obviously ordained by God. Is our calendar, the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar, are these ordained by God? For these coincidences and things to happen, they would have to be. Think about 70 AD for the destruction of Jerusalem. Is 70 a symbol? Yes. How about 31 AD, where I showed that it's dividing the week by 31, where the 62 weeks is divided by 31, right? Yes, Luke?
Just to add to that, you've got Sister Watt's prophecies of 9/11.
Yes.
And so then that ties in with that
Yeah,
as well.
so we can see that obviously there's something about our calendar that God has placed there, and we can find that with inches when we use them in measurements. Stephen Jameson sent a whole bunch of things to me about all the measurements of the charts and how, the 25-20 and all these different things are there, and I have to go over it and try to memorize all the things that he said. But we can see that God has done this for a purpose. So let's look at this 187 days. Well, 187 days, and we'll find this in more detail when we go through Samuel Snow's letters, but this would be the 18th day of the 7th month. Now, on our calendar, what would that be? So don't think about the Jewish calendar, just think about our calendar. July 18th. And what's on July 18th?
Document.
Samuel Snow's last letter. That's published before midnight, right, because there's other ones. Now, this one here, anybody know what the 9th day of the 4th month is?
April the 9th.
Yeah, okay. Well, it'll be April the 9th. But let's just look on the Jewish calendar. We don't have to convert it. So we have an option. We can look at our calendar. But if we think about it, if anybody knows that on the 9th day of the 4th month is when Jerusalem was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And this date becomes significant. And also its inversion, we're going to see in Samuel Snow's letters, even just taking the date and inverting it, the 4th day of the 9th month, we'll find has significance in Samuel Snow's letters. Now some of these get a little bit esoteric and a little bit convoluted. But the point is that we can see here specifically something that marks midnight and the Sunday law, right? October 22nd and midnight in this chiasm here.
Does that
Yeah.
9th day of the 4th month apply on both ends on each side of midnight in Samuel Snow's articles, or just one side?
Just one side.
Okay.
But the thing about this, when we look at this, of course, this is all dealing with the temple and the sanctuary, right? And that's the point, that this is...
on the side before July 21st.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's just
Yeah.
pointing it to it, not trying to say it's double.
Yeah, it's in his earlier letters. The point that I'm trying to make is that when you look at these things, these are dealing with the literal temple being destroyed, the literal temple being rebuilt, the cleansing of the heavenly sanctuary, the ministry beginning in the heavenly sanctuary, and even this history, when we think about this history in Millerite history, obviously this starts the 2300 or ends the 2300 days and starts the cleansing of the sanctuary on the Day of Atonement. But all this history is all attached to it as well. So all of this is about the sanctuary, whether it's earthly or heavenly, and it's all pointing to God's work in his people of what he's doing in heaven and on earth. It's too big a topic almost to really talk about when we start to look at it. There's so many different lines that we could look at, so many different details that we could address in looking at this history. Now, Dwayne wasn't here yesterday because we did go through the first decree. So we went through Cyrus's decree, and we could find that there's significance in the dates. And we have the decree, we nailed down where the decree came, that it has to come after the 24th day of the first month, based on Daniel 10 and 11. And that they get to Jerusalem, and on the first day of the 7th month, they build an altar, and then it's not until the 2nd month in the 2nd year of Cyrus's reign that they lay the foundation of the temple. So in each of these decrees, there's a lot more detail than we can really go through here, because you could spend a lot of time looking at all of these dates and the events that are happening. But what we know is that 3 decrees were needed. Cyrus's decree to commence or to originate, Darius's to affirm, and Artaxerxes to complete the specification of the prophecies to start the 2300 days and the 70 weeks. There's a three-step process. And here again we see the going forth, the return, and the to build. Again, in the third decree we have a three-step process to get that decree to go into effect.
So what year did you begin the first decree?
The first decree is in 536.
Okay.
Yeah. Cyrus comes to the throne in the fall of 537, and his decree is in 536. Now we can look on page 79.
Did you discuss any correlation between the 70 weeks and the 70 years based upon the reign of Cyrus?
No, I didn't, but obviously there's a correlation.
Right.
So on the bottom of the page, so I have laid out here the dates that we used to have. So last year we didn't have sunset, which we still don't really have completely. We're trying to hammer that out. But last year I had gone through Ezekiel, and I want to look at Ezekiel over here quickly. So I think we're done here with this for now, but we will go through Samuel Snow's letters tomorrow, and on Sabbath when I do the sermon, we're going to go over it again in sort of a quick way. But what we're finally going to have to do, and I'm not sure how to do it, we might be able to do it tomorrow too. I want to lay down some of these different reform lines over top of each other and see what we can see as well. So I'm not sure how to go about that.
Page 77, this one is a little more detailed that you have on the board today.
Yeah.
Do you have this one on somewhere in your files that can be sent to me on a PDF?
Yeah, and it's Samuel Snow's letters is going to give way more detail. It's really hard to look at this one because there's so much detail, and some things I've changed, and there's some typos in it. It's in your appendix, page 83. So we're going to look at those in more detail.
Are you presenting this afternoon?
Yes, we're going to go through reading Samuel Snow's letters, the ones from 1844, because we did the ones before 1844, all the way up to his testimony that he did on December 31st, 1843, that ends off that year. And then we're going to look at the ones in 1844. So let's look at this here. In Ezekiel, of course, starts on the 5th day of the 4th month, right? So he starts here. Who is Ezekiel?
Who is he?
Who is he?
He's the prophet that was on the second group of captives that went into Babylon.
Right, so he was taken captive, and he's also a priest.
Right.
And at midnight, he gives a message, and he has all these different prophecies.
This is Ezekiel 4, you mean?
Well, yeah, but Ezekiel 4 starts in Ezekiel 1,
Okay.
right? And the first date that he gives, so this is Ezekiel 1, verse 1 to 2, we find that he's on the 5th day of the 4th month, which is midnight, and as we said, this is July 21st. And the last vision that he gives is here, the 10th day of the 7th month, which is October 22, right? And this is 592, and this is 573. Now he also mentions, so we call this the Sunday law, we call this midnight, and we have two other dates that we use, the first day of the 1st month and the first day of the 5th month. And this is the midnight cry, and this here is 9/11. So Ezekiel has all of these dates, the first day of the 1st month, the first day of the 5th month, the 5th day of the 4th month, and the 10th day of the 7th month, mentioned in his, I think there's 13 dates that he mentions in Ezekiel, and these dates he mentions, And also, these two dates happen to be the same date in 1844. And the chances of that occurring by chance, I think it's 5.6 times 10 to the power of 8. That you could have this as a coincidence, that it would just occur randomly. Yes. Not that I would never play the lotto.
In other words, it's a sure bet.
Yes, you if those were the odds,
Yeah.
yeah, you wouldn't win the lottery. So we have here the first day of the first month, and you know, and I have done a presentation on this. We haven't really plumbed the depth of this well, Ezekiel, yet. We know that there's things in Ezekiel that we need to understand. Now, the first day of the 5th month, so let's look at Ezekiel here. And so we just have some time that we can use to lay down some things that are important. So in Ezekiel, and I should have these memorized. It's probably actually in my notes. Yeah, so Ezekiel 29:17. I've always loved the book of Ezekiel because I never understood it. And so I used to read it a lot and try to figure it out. But until this message came along, there was no way I was going to understand any of this. But we understand that there's these prophecies against, most of Ezekiel, the first part is prophecies against Israel and Judah, right? And then he's made dumb, not that he can't speak, but he can't speak any prophecies against Judah and Israel until such a time as somebody, when Jerusalem is destroyed, an escapee comes and tells him, and then he can then do prophecies against Judah again, and that's in chapter 33. But here in chapter 29, he's doing prophecies against Egypt, and he does all prophecies against all the, you know, the Edomites and the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Philistines and the Egyptians and the Babylonians, right? So he does these prophecies against the foreign nations, but there's a period of time in which he does not prophesy against Judah and Israel, and there's significance in that. And someday we're going to understand it all completely. But for now, I just want to look at these dates. So now this date here, even though I say this is the last date given in Ezekiel, if you look chronologically in Ezekiel, obviously the first date's the first one he gives. And in Ezekiel 40 is where he gives the 10th day of the 7th month. But it's not the latest date. That is, here in 29:17, it says, "It came to pass in the 27th year, in the first month, and the first day of the month, that the word of the Lord came unto me, saying." So this is the first month, the first day of the month, but it's the 27th year, the 27th year. So it's actually later than this date here.
Where are they counting the years from? Because at the very beginning it gives us the 30th year or the 5th year of King Jehoiachin.
Okay, so she asks a question that's important and that we were going to look at, but let's look at it right now. So where Ezekiel is,
What was the question? She was quiet.
she's asking the question, where are we counting the years from? Because in Ezekiel, when it starts here, it says that this is the 5th day of the 4th month in the 5th year of the captivity of Jehoiachin, and it's also Ezekiel's captivity. So he's taken captive when Jehoiachin is taken captive. And Jehoiachin is taken captive for 36 years, right?
So the 30th year.
Yeah. Now when it talks about the 30th year, all kinds of speculation. You know, if you go into commentaries, maybe he's 30 years old, you know, and so forth. But if we were to count 30 years, we would come to this date, 6.
Irrespective of what the commentaries say, use the number 30.
Yeah. So we're using the number 30. So if this is 592, this is 622.
Okay.
Now 622 is in the 18th year of Josiah. I spell that correctly?
In my notes, I have it put down that the 30th year after the Great Passover.
Yes. So this is the Passover of Josiah. Now, the problem is it doesn't say 30 years. It says the 30th year. There's a difference. 30 years, you would start at 0, and then you would count here. But here it says the 30th year. So it's not marking the Passover of Josiah, but it's marking the year that the Passover of Josiah occurs, but it's counting something that is the 30th year. Now the Passover of Josiah, if we look at what this is saying here, this is the 10th day of the 7th month. So when you go to Ezekiel 40 and you read about it, it says it's in Rosh Hashanah in the 10th day of the 7th month. Well, actually, it doesn't even say it's the 7th month. It just says the 10th day. And we know it's the 7th month because when you call Rosh Hashanah the 10th day, then it means it's a Jubilee year and it's in the 7th month. So this is the 49th year, which is a Jubilee year. And if you count backwards, you come to this year being the first year of the Jubilee cycle. So the Jubilee cycle begins in the fall of 622. So the 30th year is starting here in the fall, and that's the first year. So when you get here, he's now in the 30th year of the Jubilee cycle, and it ends on the Jubilee.
So it's really talking not about the kings, but it's more about the...
Yeah. So here he's in the 30th year of the Jubilee cycle, or the sabbatical cycle, Jubilee cycle, and he's on the 5th day of the 4th month. And it's in the 5th year of the captivity, right? So this is the 5 years here. And the captivity is in 597, in the spring that Jehoiachin is taken captive. And that means this is 25 years. And this here, we're going to find there's this time prophecy that goes from 977 to 627. And this time prophecy is the time prophecy of Josiah. That's what I forgot, the age. And this is, and we talked about this earlier, where you have on November 22nd, the 15th day of the 8th month, in 977, you have Jeroboam offering an offering and his counterfeit altar with his counterfeit feast day. And the disobedient prophet comes in and tells him that Josiah is going to come and burn dead man's bones on an altar. Yes, Dwayne.
That's the number 8.
What's the number 8?
977 is associated with the 8th month. It's the number 8.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So then if you take it to the end of the world, he's the 8th of the 7th.
Okay. Well, we could do that. What we know, though, is that there's a time prophecy, or not a time prophecy, there's a prophecy that's fulfilled here. And this means this is the time of the end. And this is 350 years later that this occurs. Now,
You're discussing then the work of Josiah from the prophesy that he would burn the bones of the prophets.
yeah, so here he burns the bones of the prophets, dead man's bones, on the altar in Bethel.
Right.
Now he begins this the year earlier, or at least a few months earlier, in the 12th year, when he begins to clean Judah and Jerusalem. And then he also goes into northern Israel, which Bethel is in northern Israel, and he also cleans up things up there, even though it's not part of his kingdom.
Leaves the sepulcher of the prophet intact, right?
Yes. Yeah, he leaves the sepulcher of the prophets intact. And you can find this in 1 Kings 13, verse 1 to 5, and this is 2 Kings 23, verses, I can't remember, 15 to 18.
Irrespective of the dates, or just, I don't mean to say to discount them, but to just, rather than burden your mind with all the chronology, have you overlaid the book Prophets and Kings over this?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
Okay, we might have to do that. So anyway, the point is there's this prophecy that Ezekiel has that he's given on the 5th day of the 4th month at midnight. He has this prophecy, and that's in Ezekiel 4, verse 4 to 6. So there's last year's camp meeting. I go through the prophecy. And that prophecy is the 390-day and the 40-day prophecy. And that prophecy is pointing, he's here at midnight, and he's giving a day for a year prophecy, and he's using this as the starting point for the 390 that's going to end here in 587 when the siege begins. So this is the 390 years. It's a day for a year prophecy for Israel. And then he also has a 40-day prophecy, which is 40 years, and that's going to go from the fulfillment of the prophecy of Josiah. So there's 40 years for Judah. And they both end at the siege. So at midnight, he's giving a prophecy that points to the siege, and the siege is the midnight cry. And then 18 months later, in 586, Jerusalem is destroyed, which is the Sunday law.
The prophetic overlay of the triumphal entry in the time of Christ.
Okay, well, you'd have to explain that to me.
All right.
I'm a simple man. Yes.
It's because of midnight.
Yeah.
It's because of the midnight cry. You can see the triumphal entry in here.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
In the time of the end, at the birth of Josiah.
Why wouldn't
Because
I
it-
begin it at the birth?
Because it says, "Behold, a child shall be born unto the house of Judah."
Because the time prophecy ends here. You can tie them together. You can tie Josiah's birth and this prophecy together.
That's
But
what
the point is, the
asking.
time period that's here is what's being marked by here. So if I'm going to say the time of the end, it always has to be the end of a time prophecy
Yes.
or a prophecy. I have to stand over here. Does that make sense? So, I mean, whether you want to start at, the time of the end specifically when Josiah is born, that would be...
Why I ask is in the 40, the empowerment of the message could begin from 627.
Right.
Which would give you the 40 from 911 to, so you would have a better structure, like...
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's just here, this is a Passover in this year, and so we would have to say, this is 9/11, right?
No,
No?
where you have the beginning of the 40 as 911. 627.
No, that's the time of the end.
This is the same structure of the 430 years of Abraham, because 390 plus 4 it gives you 430. So it's the same, demonstrates the same thing of the sojourning and the affliction of God.
Yeah, she's adding the 40 and the 390 together. So I'm not sure that's, maybe we could do that. But obviously there isn't a 430-year period here. But this is what I do. I put this as 9/11. This is midnight. And so, is this sunset? That's the question. I don't know. So maybe I'm wrong. But this is just the way I was looking at it, trying to understand this. So we don't know yet how to place this. And Olivine could be correct. Maybe the idea is that we would look at this differently. But there's reasons why I look at this, which I'm going to show tomorrow, why I look at it this way.
This is associated with, because you see in Josiah and what we understand about Hezekiah and the priests and the Levites is the cleansing of the temple.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you see at the midnight cry.
Well, yeah.
The midnight cry is the second temple cleansing in the history of the Millerites.
Yes. So, when we look at this history, we look at this prophecy. So what we were doing last year is we're saying the prophecy of Josiah is the prophecy of Josiah Litch, right? Because there was all these predictions and fulfillments. And so we were comparing this with Millerite history and understanding that there was a prophecy that happens first, Josiah Litch's prophecy, that then leads to this prophecy here at midnight. Yes.
One of the things about Litch's prophecy was that Sister White tells us that it brought great impetus to the message, and empowerment of the first angel's message is what she's referring to, but she doesn't say so, but we know it's the first angel's message that's being empowered, right?
Yeah. So this has to,
One of the things about Litch's prophecy was that many of the Millerites were pointing to the fact that this was going to be the close of probation. This was they were telling the world that you're coming to the last place in that prophetic structure where your probation was going to close. And so, is there a close of probation in the history of Josiah? Is there a close of probation in the history of Ezekiel? Is there a close of probation in the history of Ezra?
yeah,
So all of these are pointing to the autumnal type of October 22nd, 1844, where there was a close of probation.
yeah. So,
So there is a factor involved in Litch's prediction that put the fear of God in those who were watching for the event about to transpire. And they all were thinking that it was going to be the close of their probation. Those who were
yeah,
the naysayers.
yeah.
They were convicted, for sure.
Yeah, so dealing with the close of probation in this history, this history of Josiah happens in that 70 years period of probation from when Manasseh is taken captive and Jerusalem is ultimately going to be destroyed. This history of Josiah happens here, the history of Josiah, happens in that 70 years. Josiah dies in 609, and then the Babylonian captivity begins 2 years later in 607. So that ends that period of probation of 70 years. So Josiah's history, now here we have Ezekiel referring back to this history. So right from the beginning, when he says it's in the 30th year, he's referring back to this year of the first year of the cycle. Whether it's the true cycle or not is another question, because Ezekiel uses lots of things like a temple with all these services that are not actually real. And so the argument is this sabbatical cycle the real sabbatical cycle that God gave, or is it something that Ezekiel is using as an illustration? So whether this was truly a Jubilee year or not is not decided upon, not by me, not by others. You know, whether this was actually a Jubilee year or not, we don't know. But what we do know is that as a symbol it works, and that there's this close of probation that happens here. And, you know, we may be able to refine this, because if we look at the empowerment of the message, you know, Olavine's trying to say that the empowerment would be here, the time of the end would be when Josiah is born, because it talks about a child being born, Josiah by name. So that could be, and so we might have a different way in which we try to understand this, but I put this as 9/11, and so we're going to leave it there for now. But this history happens here. This is a Passover. So a Passover obviously can be a symbol of 9/11 or the first day of the first month, even though it's not. So we're going to have to decide on those things, or somebody's going to have to, sometime in the future. This 25 and 5 was used by Tabo, not in this history per se, but in the story of Abraham leaving Haran here, the birth of Isaac, and then the 5 years later when the 400 years begins. So this 30 years being divided into 25 and 5 is significant. Yeah, Tyler.
That's exactly what I was thinking about earlier when I had my hand raised about the 25 and the 5, is that this is just another witness that we need to grapple with of that, because in the context of the weaning and everything, which we know we're going to be looking at, that this would be a third or fourth witness for the 25-5 breakdown. You know, you have, I can't remember all of them, but you have this one, you have Abraham's, you have 508 to 538, with
there's
533 in the middle, or as the 5.
And we have some in France or something too, or whatever.
Yeah, there's several of them. I can't remember all of them. So this is something that needs to be considered in the weaning argument.
Yeah.
Because this would be the same pattern.
Yes.
But I think before we do that, I think we need to go to the natural before we apply the spirit to make sure that the application is correct. I'm not denying that there's not a 5, but I just think that in the history of Abraham, you're not going to see it there if you really go to the natural, the way it actually happened.
For sure.
Okay, obviously. Yeah, there's no way you can apply the spiritual to something that didn't occur. It's like, this is kind of an aside, but growing up, in the United Church of Canada, which was pretty liberal, my dad didn't believe that Jesus was resurrected. But he says he didn't have to believe in the fact of the resurrection, he just needed to believe in the truth of the resurrection. So, obviously, you can't have a truth without a fact to support it. So it's the same here, what Tanya's talking about. There has to be facts. You actually have to have that history in order to have it as a symbol. So that's an important point.
I was talking to her about this on the telephone, and the prophetic symbol is being used. I think this is easily solved. It may be easily solved, but by the fact that the number 5 in the weaning of Isaac is a prophetic symbol, but I believe the literal is going to show that it was a 3-year period.
Okay, well, we're going to figure that out.
Maybe you see now the history that
Yeah.
there's a 5.
Yeah,
I'm not
but-
denying that.
Yeah, so anyway, we're going to look at, so we see this here, and we pointed this out because we wanted to understand this, and we can see that the first day of the first month becomes a symbol of 9/11. And we also have this one, so in Ezekiel, just to kind of finish this off, in Ezekiel 26, we'll turn there. So this is in the middle of all these judgments against the different nations, and this is the judgment on Tyre, or Tyrus.
This is similar to Jeremiah's same judgments.
Yes.
Very similar.
There's a great deal of similarity between Jeremiah and
Right.
Ezekiel. But it says, it came to pass in the 11th year, in the first day of the month, that the word of the Lord came unto me. Verse 1 of Ezekiel 26. So this one doesn't tell you which month it is. And so when we were looking out for all the first days of the 5th months, this one was passed by, because it doesn't tell you it's the 5th month. But there's a reason why it doesn't tell you, because you should know, if you know what he's talking about. And so Ezekiel doesn't say in the 5th month, because he doesn't need to. He says, Son of man, because that Tyrus hath said against Jerusalem, Aha, she is broken, that was the gates of the people. She is turned unto me, I shall be replenished, now she is laid waste. So what are they mocking Jerusalem for? What has just happened to Jerusalem? Yeah, the walls it hasn't been destroyed yet, it's broken. The brokenness is when the walls were broken down, and that happened on the 9th day of the 4th month.
What do we do with Jeremiah 1:3, where it says that in the 5th month, and to the carrying away of Jerusalem captive in the 5th month?
Yeah, the 5th month is when the temple was destroyed.
Okay, and the
So
4th...
Nebuzaradan came in and they destroyed the city and the temple. That happens in the 5th month. It's a month later.
But what you give in the 4th month and the 9th day, that's what?
The 4th month and the 9th day is when the walls of Jerusalem are broken down. There's 2 different events.
Where it says, mark this day.
That's the siege. So the one in Ezekiel 29 is marking the siege. Ezekiel never mentions specifically that it's in the 11th year of Zedekiah, on the 9th day of the month, on the 9th day of the 4th month, that the walls are broken. That's mentioned other places. That's in Jeremiah.
And it is in Kings as well.
And it's in Kings.
So you're saying the 11th year has to do with the...
Zedekiah's 11th year.
That's what I'm saying, right.
And in Ezekiel, whenever he says it's the year of the captivity, he's referring to Jehoiachin's reign, which goes fall to fall. And when he's talking about when he just says the 11th year or the 9th year, he's talking about the reign of Zedekiah that runs spring to spring. So I did a whole presentation dealing with how Ezekiel uses 2 different calendars, a fall to fall and a spring to spring, because he's marking some events of Jehoiachin's captivity.
But he's narrating the histories that have taken place by using those 2 calendars.
Right. So he's using 2 calendars for very specific reasons. One is because he's marking Jehoiachin as if he's still reigning. And so when he talks about in the year of the captivity, like in chapter 4, it's in the 25th year of the captivity, then he's referencing a date that we have to understand as going from a fall to fall calendar, not a spring to spring calendar. But this one here is the spring to spring calendar.
Well, this means then he was also in agreement with the prophecy of Jeremiah.
Yes. Yeah.
This is one of the telltale signs that these two prophets are telling the same story.
Yes, exactly. So anyway, the point, we just got to finish this off. So Jerusalem had just had the walls broken on the 9th day of the 4th month. And then it says, it came to pass on the 11th year, and the 1st day of the month. This is the month following the 4th month. Right? Because the walls were broken in the 4th month on the 9th day. So if you're going to have a month that's not named, it would be assumed you're talking about the next month. They're not going to tell you the first day and not mention it if it's the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, or whatever month. So just naturally you follow with the 4th month the walls were broken. Now Tyre is exalting, and it's on the first day of the 5th month that Ezekiel is given this vision about Tyre exalting over the fact that Jerusalem is broken. Does that make sense? So it has to be the 5th month, or otherwise it's a meaningless. And Ezekiel is very specific about his dates. But it's hidden. And this is another important point, that God has hidden certain things so that we wouldn't see them until the time. And the same with Ezekiel 40, verse 1. It's not really clear. Many people just take it as the 10th day of the 1st month in Nisan, because it doesn't tell you. But it does tell you it's Rosh Hashanah. And Rosh Hashanah is referring to the head of the year, which is in the fall, not in the spring. So we can see that all these dates are here in Ezekiel, and they're all very significant, and they show our lines, 9/11, midnight cry, and the Sunday law. And we're filling in these lines still. We're seeing more and more details. But we know that Ezekiel is at midnight. He begins at midnight. And so the light of Ezekiel is the light of midnight. And so the light that we have at midnight has to come from the book of Ezekiel, part of it, right? It comes obviously from Daniel and Revelation. But the book of Ezekiel gives us some very specific light. And so that's why we need to study Ezekiel, because it's going to give us light about what's going to happen at midnight.
This gives me some insights to Ezekiel 37.
Yes, Ezekiel 37.
Because
I wrote a whole paper on it.
Right. What you see here is the Ezekiel 37 can be applied, but then in various histories when there's flesh put on these dry bones. Yeah. So in other words, even in the history of the 3 decrees, the 30th chapter of Ezekiel can apply. And when you get to the history of William Miller, what you're seeing in the entire apostasy of the church is fleshed out, so to speak, in the history of Miller. And so you see flesh coming on the dry bones in the history of the Millerites. And then finally you're going to see in the last generation, in the 4th generation, you're going to see the final act in how the dry bones are fleshed out and they become a living army.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, well, Dwayne, do you want to give us closing prayer?
Loving Father in heaven, Amos tells us that you will do nothing except you reveal it to your servants, the prophets. And so we're grateful, dear Lord, for the spirit of prophecy and the work that you have done in the revelation of the death and resurrection of your Son, the importance that this all means to those who are now living at the end of the world and our dependence upon the correct understanding of your inspired word. Lord, help us to be students that will apply this to our own experience, that we will not just come and listen and have our ears tickled, but that we will investigate all of these things for ourselves, personally and individually, and that we will have a thus saith the Lord, and we'll know that our feet have been shod with the gospel of peace, and that we will be among those who will give the loud cry. We pray in Jesus' name.